this is Rachel from SunBearGlassCraft, and in today's video we are going on a journey. Mid-journey specifically. If you aren't already aware, there's currently an AI bot that's going around the internet called Mid-Journey, and basically what you do is you put in a prompt and this AI creates art based on your prompt. Now, when I first started experimenting with this, I immediately just started typing in stained glass everything. AI isn't necessarily very good at making stained glass templates. Like, it gets the vibe, but like the pieces are kind of weird and it'll put a bunch of extra stuff. But it got me thinking, what if I took the AI generated image and altered it in Clip Studio Paint to make an actual usable stained glass template? In the meat and potatoes of today's video, I will show you how I took this AI generated image and turned it into this actual stained glass art for my studio. If you like today's video and find it helpful, please leave a like and consider subscribing. And I also have the links to my Etsy store where this pattern can be found, as well as my Patreon and any other important link in the description box down below. Patreon, I have exclusive patterns and sun catchers which go out monthly, so if you're interested in something like that, you can check out the link down below. I really hope you liked today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and let's go ahead and get started. So for this piece, I started out with the prompt Gothic flower, symmetry, rose window, simple stained glass. And I didn't really like any of the options that it came up with, so I decided to re-roll and come up with 4 new options. The new options that were created were much closer to what I was envisioning, and the upper left especially caught my eye because it reminded me a lot of this Gothic piece I made when I first started doing stained glass. I absolutely love Gothic architecture, but I didn't like those colors because my whole studio is very natural, greens and plants, so it just never fit. It felt promising though, so this is what I decided to base the template off of, so I went ahead and saved the image and imported it into Clip Studio Paint. I didn't want the template to be the exact same as the AI generated image, so this took me about an hour to kind of fiddle around with and figure out the final version that I wanted to make in glass. As you can see, I split up the petals and then did some variations of the middle to where I eventually came up with this, and I really struggled with figuring out a color, but I eventually figured it out. So this is the final pattern, and then these are the colors that I decided on. I'm always relatively indecisive about glass colors to use, but for this, I knew I wanted to use transparent because I do not work with enough transparents, and these were the 4 options I came up with. I have this dark gray that has kind of bubble texture in it, a medium beige-ish, yellow for the center, and then of course my favorite green English muffle. It's like this beautiful mossy color for the leaves. I used Rapid Resizer to resize the pattern to the size I want, and then printed out a version on cardstock paper as well as normal printer paper. For all stained glass patterns, you want to work smarter, not harder. So for the bulk of these pieces, I just cut out 1 piece and then just made 4 of each. Before I cut into my large sheets, I like to go ahead and check my little Tupperware bins to see if I have any scrappy bits that I might be able to use for my project. Since these center pieces are pretty small, it would be a waste to cut into a large sheet, so I found this rectangular bit that had this nice texture to it and decided to use that. I personally like to trace my pattern pieces onto the glass with Sharpie, and you can use black Sharpie or metallic Sharpie. This might seem obvious, but for lighter color glass I use my black Sharpie, and for darker glass I'll use my metallic Sharpies. The method of getting your pattern on your glass is completely up to you. Some people glue the paper on. I like Sharpie. If you're working with a textured glass and you want that texture to be visible, it's important to remember to flip your pattern pieces over and trace everything upside down. It is way easier to cut glass on the smooth side, so just keep that in mind so you don't waste pieces of glass and have weird backwards pieces. Now that I have all of my pieces traced onto my glass, we can go ahead and start cutting. I personally prefer to work at a standing desk, that way I can keep my arm tucked into my hip and use my hip to maneuver, but it is entirely up to you and what is comfortable for you. When scoring your glass, use a firm, even pressure, and you ideally want to hear this kind of zipper sound. If there's little pieces of glass flying away from the score line, you are scoring way too hard. Not even a few minutes ago, I told you to cut on the smoother side of your glass, but sometimes it's unavoidable and you just gotta do the best you can. This glass is extremely textured on both sides, so I'm just going to go ahead and score on the side that I traced it on, and you'll actually see me get caught on a little air bubble, and sometimes that happens and you just gotta work through it, push through, you'll be good, I promise. For breaking glass, these running pliers come in extremely handy for these long strips you need to cut off of your larger sheets, and especially if that glass is transparent. I do find that sometimes with thicker, more textured glass as well as opaques, I don't trust the runners all the time, so I use what I call the back tap method. As you can see, I'm tapping the backside of that score line, and you can see the score line deepening as I'm tapping. Then I can go in with my running pliers and it breaks no problem. I use both of these breaking methods interchangeably, and usually it just depends on which one I want to do to get through the glass faster. One issue with the back tap method is that sometimes you can be left with these little bits, which you can see here. That's not a problem, I just go in with my breaking pliers and clean up the edges. I used to not use running pliers, although someone purchased me a new pair, so I use them more and more, and now I really like them, although I don't 100% trust them. For a lot of mottled glass and my really fancy art glass, I will still prefer to go in with my back tap method just because I trust that more than running pliers for that glass. I do still use my grozing pliers, although I wait to use those until I actually clean up all the bits on the edges of the glass, which you'll see in a few clips here. I get this question all the time, and that is, if I use the Sharpie method and I trace my pieces onto the glass, where do I cut? And the answer is you want to cut as close to the inside of the Sharpie mark as possible. It's not going to be perfect. Here you can see I kind of wavered a little bit, but inside is going to be the best place to cut. If you cut on the outside of the Sharpie mark, you're going to have way too much glass and you're going to overuse your grinder, or you're just going to simply have pieces that don't fit in your pattern and don't leave room for your foil. I try to minimize the usage of my grinder as much as possible and really clean up these pieces. So I have these really tiny grozers, which I'll put a link to down below, that I absolutely love, and I have shown them to other people and they have purchased them and love them too. These are fantastic for getting these tiny little pieces off of the edge of your glass. I will go around and do this for every piece, cleaning it up as best as I can, and I like to put the pieces on the pattern just to see where I'm at, and then we can go ahead and start grinding. I'm going to preface this by saying my grinder is extremely dirty and also kind of janky, so just ignore that. Basically for grinding, I go ahead and do a first pass, and I just want to get rid of all the jagged edges, smooth everything out, and try to get it to the shape that I think it is supposed to be. The key to the first pass is to not grind too much. You can always take more off, but you can't put glass back on. For my smaller, more detailed sections, I have this smaller grinder bit up top, and I make sure to have my wet sponge on it while I'm grinding. You do not want glass dust dry, spraying everywhere, plus if it's dry, you can break your glass. It's inevitable on your first pass that you're going to miss sections, so I will put it onto my pattern for reference, use a metallic Sharpie or just a Sharpie in general, and mark the area that I need to go back over. I'm not a huge fan of grinding, so this is definitely the best part. Once you finally put the last pieces on your template and you know you can start foiling or prepping for foiling. Before you actually start foiling, you want to get all of the glass dust, fingerprints, dirt, and anything else off of your glass. So I'll go in with this old rag that has rubbing alcohol on it, and I'll just go over all the edges and the front and back of the glass. This step is super important and only takes a few minutes, but it's really going to make sure that your foil adheres properly. This isn't to say that foil couldn't still lift further down the road in the project, but doing this will make it much less likely. I like to keep all my foil in the foil caddy, and they actually have these really cool little holes that you can pull the foil through to keep it all organized, but I'm too lazy to do that. This belonged to my grandpa, so it's old and the foot is broken, but it's fine, it still works. I had trouble deciding if I wanted to do copper-backed or black-backed foil, but for this I decided on 7/32 black-backed foil for the entire project. I like to pull my foil out, remove the backing, and then whenever I apply the foil, I start the piece on an inner side. If you start the foil anywhere where it's going to be on an outer edge and you don't plan on applying lead came, there's a little lip that can form and it can lift more easily and it just generally doesn't look as good. So I like to start my foil on an inner edge where it's going to be bumped up against another piece. As I apply my foil, I like to put downward pressure and really smush that foil into the glass with my middle and ring finger. If there's any pieces on the glass that are really concave, such as this, I make sure to give that area extra attention and really smush it down. I cut my foil to where there's maybe a centimeter, half a centimeter of overhang to where I started the foil. I like to start crimping on either the largest or flattest part of the glass, and I really like to make sure I tuck in those corners so there's a lot of overlap. The best technique for laying down foil on concave parts is to rub your finger on the foil to heat it up and slowly push the foil down as you're rubbing it. If you do this and really take your time with it, the chance of the foil cracking is super low. Although these concave parts aren't really that extreme, but I have done some crazy angles with that technique and had no cracking. Here you can see that technique up close. Warm up the foil with your finger while slowly laying it down. Tuck in those corners so you have nice overlap, and just really take your time with it. You might think you're done, but you are not done foiling your piece. You still have one more step. As you can see, there's all these little wrinkles in the foil, and that is not good. If we leave those, flux could get in there and it could cause lifting. It's just not properly adhered. So we're going to go in with our handy dandy fid and smooth all those wrinkles out. I'm pretty heavy-handed when I go into burnish like this, but you want to be careful not to be too intense about it because you can rip the foil if you're like really strong-arming it. So just get the wrinkles out. It doesn't have to be perfect. Also, don't forget to burnish or flatten out the foil on the edges, especially if the edges are exposed. On any concave section, I will go ahead and do the front and back of the glass, then I will burnish the edges, and then I will go back over the front and back of the glass just to make sure the foil is properly adhered. It might seem like overkill, but any wrinkle or any imperfection that's left in the foil can cause lifting while you're soldering further down the road. Now we can start soldering, and you'll see me starting to apply flux here on all of the joints so I can go ahead and start tacking. I also want to tell you a little bit about my soldering setup so you can understand the safety precautions that I take while I am soldering. As you can see, while I'm soldering or handling anything with flux or lead, I wear gloves. And I also have a piece of recycled paper on my table, and that way everything that's going to touch the lead, solder, anything that I'm touching can stay on that paper, and when I go to clean up, I can just roll the paper up and throw it away. The little blue triangle that you see on the top of the screen is a smoke absorber made by Hako, and then I also am wearing a respirator because the smoke absorber doesn't always suction up the fumes as well as I'd like. I purchased the respirator on Amazon and it works really well. I can't smell a single thing while I'm wearing it, so that's good and I know it's working. Anytime I'm working with solder, like usually I do a soldering day, I have de-lead wipes that I use to wipe my hands before I pick up my water bottle or drink. Even though I'm wearing gloves, I'm being extra cautious and I use the de-lead wipes on my hands and my arms. And then I also have a de-lead spray that I use to clean all of my utensils that I use while I'm soldering. I of course clean all the utensils once I'm done using them, and I have this little plastic sheet that I set them on, spray everything down, and clean it up and wipe it down. I got my lead levels tested about 4 months after I started doing everything I just described, and they were way below average. I know of tons of veteran artists who don't do a single thing I just described. They don't wear gloves, they don't use a respirator, they don't do anything, and they're fine. That's not to say you shouldn't do everything I'm doing. You know, it might seem like overkill, but I personally just want to make sure I'm taking care of my body and I can do this craft for as long as possible without having adverse health effects. So with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into what the heck I'm actually doing. I personally don't like to pin my projects because I'm lazy. Pinning your projects makes it a lot easier, and I know that some people will actually use blue painter's tape on the backside of their glass to keep their project together. I'm lazy and I have yet to do that, so I position all my pieces with this tiny little tool and then just hope for the best. It's really whatever is the most convenient for you. I use a wet sponge to clean the tip of my iron before I start soldering and throughout the soldering process. The very first step for soldering your project is going to be tacking. So basically what I'm going to do is go around the entire project and tack all of the places that the pieces meet. This is going to ensure that I don't have to worry about bumping the project and the pieces moving around. There's a lot of different techniques with soldering, and I want to make sure that I go ahead and touch on all of them, especially because my techniques have changed since the first soldering technique video that I posted. Something that's going to make your life very easy if you're soldering is going to be doing something called tinning. Now, I don't explicitly tin, I kind of do in my own way, but basically tinning is going over the entire project with like a really ugly thin layer of solder. I put a semi-thick-ish layer of solder on my project. I don't know if it's still considered tinning, but basically I go in and I do my first layer of solder and I don't worry about how it looks. I will go in and I make it pretty afterwards. Tinning makes it easier for you to apply solder and for you to get a really nice even bead. So what you do is you get your solder all over your project, and then I like to reapply flux. That way it flows really easily when I add more solder and try to make my line work really. I am going to speed up some of the soldering parts so you can at least see what I'm doing, but if I don't speed it up, this video will be an hour and a half long, so I don't want it to be an hour and a half long, so these parts I'm speeding up and I will do that for the rest of the video. I've done it in past videos, y'all have already seen it. While you're tinning, you of course also want to tin the outer edges. If you saw earlier, I have my iron at 460. You really want to make sure you go over those edges quickly, because I find that if you concentrate on the edges too long with that high of a temperature, you're going to have a little bit of lifting. Here you can see we're starting the next part of the soldering process, where I'm going to reapply flux all over the front part of my project. I tinned everything. I got just like a nice ugly layer of solder on there, so now I'm going to go back and focus on making it look really nice and smooth. As I mentioned earlier, since I've been doing stained glass longer, my techniques for soldering have slightly changed since the original video that I made. The main techniques that I mentioned in the original video were doing, I think I called it the bit by bit technique and versus continuous flow. And I've had some people comment saying that, oh, continuous flow is going to be better and make sure you don't get heat fractures. Now, I'm not saying I disagree with that, but I kind of used a mixture of doing bit by bit, as I called it, where I kind of added it in. And that was my kind of poor beginner technique, I would say. I do try my best to have a continuous flow now, but I personally have only ever had one heat fracture, and I'm pretty sure that that was because the glass already had an imperfection in it that I didn't catch because I was a beginner. That's not me trying to discredit this veteran glass artist from what they said. I love seeing comments like that because I'm always learning. I try to tell people and remind people all the time that I'm self-taught, and everything that I've come to has been from, trial and error, as well as people correcting me and teaching me and telling me things. I never want my techniques or my videos to come off as this is the way you should do things, this is the end all be all, and I really try to emphasize that I'm sharing the way that I do things, and I'm constantly learning and constantly trying to improve the techniques that I use. As I said, I simply wanted to share my techniques and share what I do and kind of, help demystify the process and help people understand that there's different ways of doing things and that this is the way that I do things. And I'm pretty sure that every single stained glass artist doesn't do the exact same thing. Everyone's going to do things differently and in a different way. Now that I have that whole spiel out of the way, I wanted to go ahead and touch on the actual techniques that I'm using in this video. So as you can see, I'm trying to do a continual flow. Now I already have the solder on here, so right now what I'm doing is trying to make it pretty and make it as smooth as possible. If you're having difficulty, if you're going over an area repeatedly and it's giving you trouble, I would say, first of all, you need to keep reapplying flux. Flux is going to make sure you have a nice even bead. Second of all, something to keep in mind is that if you continually work an area, you can have melt through, where the glass heats up so much that you've worked it so much that the solder starts just melting through and it bleeds into the back and the front will flatten out. So if that happens, you need to just leave the area alone, move to another area, and then come back to it once the glass is cool. I would say that the other main way that my technique has changed is that I try to work higher temperatures into my soldering. So in the past, I was pretty hard-lined at saying I was always at 410, and now I tend to use 460 more just because I've practiced with it more and I'm getting used to it. Before, I would have tons of melt through because I overworked areas, and now I'm kind of learning how to work at 460 a little bit better. I haven't even tried any temperatures higher than that, so if you've tried them and you like them, like maybe I'll try it, but I'm not even gonna get started at higher temperatures. Something that I want to reflect on with this project specifically is I actually had a pretty difficult time blending those corners where the leaves meet the petals, we'll call them. There's a pretty big solder joint there, and I had trouble with blending it all together and making it nice and smooth. Now, I originally had planned to do a black patina, so some of the areas I ended up just giving up on and I was like, oh, I'll do black. I ended up doing copper, which I'm not mad at. I love how the copper came out. But something that I struggled with, and you'll see here, I kept reapplying flux on these areas. It can be really hard with large globs of solder like that. So you can see I kind of go in and just try to leave my iron there to let the whole area melt. And I find that that helps a little bit more with blending in with those solder lines. Blending these areas was the last nitpicky thing that I needed to work on, so we're pretty much done with the front, but before we move to the back, I'm going to show you how I added copper wire on the leaves to give them nice veins. I feel like the theme of the video is just turned into like when in doubt, apply flux, but as you can see, I'm going to apply flux to the solder line and to the copper wire before we even attempt to solder the wire onto the piece. I like to have the template somewhere close by, and in this case, because the glass is transparent, I'm just going to solder on top of it so I know where I want the copper wire to go. I like to leave my copper wire on the roll when I solder it on and then just snip it off with lead nippers. I'm not super concerned with making the little bead where the wire is attached pretty, but I do try my best to blend it. And something you want to keep in mind is you want to make sure before you go over that main solder line the wire is attached to, is that you want to make sure the wire is attached to the second point. If you don't do this, your wire will just get sucked up into your solder line, and I've had it happen. I actually recorded it happen in this video or in this, creation process, but I don't know where in my footage that is. It's just gone. So just keep that in mind. Now we can go ahead and move to the back, and of course we are going to apply flux evenly to the entire piece before we start. There's really not much that I can say in addition to this, just because we've already soldered the front and I explained all of that. The one thing I will say, actually two things, there's two things, is that soldering the back I find tends to be a lot easier because all of those holes and all the gaps between the pieces have already been filled in by the solder in the front, so I find that solder flows a bit more easily when you're soldering the back. The second thing that you'll want to keep in mind is that when you're soldering the back, there are pockets that form in those cracks because you soldered the front already. So those pockets tend to cause popping and bubbling when you're going into solder. Because of this, you'll not only want to be careful and, of course, make sure you're wearing your safety glasses. You should already be wearing your safety glasses for like basically every part of stained glass, but especially for soldering. And you'll also run into a problem sometimes where you'll keep having bubbling in your solder lines, and sometimes you'll have to go over a space quite a few times to get those bubbles out of there. I don't think it happened in any of the footage that I have, but basically what happens is there'll be air bubbles, so you'll go over your solder line and then you'll see part of the solder line start to sink, and then it creates this little crater, and it's like a perfect hole crater thing that forms in the solder, and it's super frustrating. The way that I've found that works best to fix this is to go over your solder line as slowly as possible, and that way it just kind of melts everything down in there and fills in that hole, that pocket of air that's creating that bubble. We are still not done. We still have to do our edges, which is something I think most people struggle with, and it's the comment that I get the most in regards to soldering. At this point, I shouldn't even have to say it, but apply your flux. That way we can go ahead and bead the edges. I've racked my brain with trying to find ways to explain how to bead more easily, and honestly, I don't really know. There's a few main points that I'll try to explain, but a lot of it's just going to come with practice. First of all, you can see what I just did is I turned down my iron to 410 because I absolutely do not like beading edges at 460. I think it's too hot and it makes the solder fall off the edges. The main thing that's going to make beading your edges easy, or as easy as possible, is going to be trying to keep the piece as level as possible. Whatever you're beading needs to be level. I know it can be difficult with these curved edges, but you just have to do your best. I grab a little bit of solder from my spool and then I put it on whatever area I'm trying to bead, and then you can see I kind of move back and forth in no more than an inch long section. If an edge is really long, sometimes I'll lengthen that section a bit, but I find that if I'm spreading the solder too thin over too long of an area, it's going to force me to go over an area more. I don't know if that makes sense, and I don't know if that is 100% true. In my mind, I feel like that's true, and I feel like that's why I work in small sections. But like I said, this is something that it's a very intuitive part of the soldering process. So I'm trying my best to explain it, but I don't know how well I'm doing. This is honestly the most finicky part of soldering in my opinion, and my least favorite because of that. You really just want to make sure you're taking your time with it and you're not missing any places. Like these recesses, these holes that I left, you have to make sure you're, soldering everything. You don't want to leave anything unsoldered, obviously. But sometimes, you're tired of soldering, things can get overlooked. My final main piece of advice when it comes to soldering is going to be, if you need to fix anything, it's going to be the easiest to fix it while you're already there. I find that if I need to come back to a project and solder it like the next day, there's something about that cooling and it seems like the solder just sets and it makes it so much more difficult to work with, even if you apply as much flux as you can possibly cram on there without drowning it. With bigger projects, I can honestly say that I dread soldering because I know that like once you start, you are in it. You are there until it is done, and sometimes that's why I procrastinate, is because I just know it's going to be this multi-hour undertaking because the solder is going to blend better and be more easy to fix if you solder all at the same time. I've gone over this before, but I like to make my jump rings out of 16 gauge or 14 gauge copper wire. This one was one I had already made up and I just needed to cut to size, and this is a 16 gauge pre-tinned copper wire. For this, I wanted to make my jump ring kind of oblong, so I used my lead nippers to cut a little bit out of that ring, and then I used them to kind of bend it and shape it to the shape that I wanted. Then it's simple enough. I just use my other little jewelry nipper thingies to hold it and simply solder it to a solder line. I know I emphasize this all the time, but you do not want to solder your jump rings to the outer foil. It is not going to have enough strength, and for something heavy especially, it is going to eventually just end up detaching. So you want to solder those jump rings to an actual solder line. Next, I'll go ahead and wash my piece with CJ's Flux Remover, although you can also use like a nice mild like Dawn dish soap. Just be sure you're not washing this anywhere that there's going to be food prepared. This has lead in it. Once my piece is dry, I like to go ahead and go in with a magic eraser slash just a melamine sponge, and I like to buff out all of the surfaces of the solder to really make it nice and vibrant and bright for that solder. I find that doing this, agitates the edges and makes it so the patina can stick to it better. I'm going to be completely honest, I don't know what it is about the melamine sponges that does this. I don't know scientifically what's going on. For this part too, I will emphasize that because you are buffing the lead, I like to wear gloves when I'm polishing and when I'm doing this part and when I'm polishing, because you'll see all that black that was on the sponge. I'm pretty sure that's just straight up lead, so I don't want that on my hands. You can wash your hands. I would prefer to just wear gloves and then, wash my hands as well. I'm kind of crazy about not wanting to touch any of it though. That's just me. So as you can see, I'm going around my entire piece with my sponge, including the edges. Do not forget your edges. Now with my piece prepped, I like to go ahead and cut up a little wash rag, just in a small enough square that I can use it to apply my patina. You 100,000,000% want to have gloves on for this because this is a chemical, and I also make sure that I wear my respirator and have my smoke absorber close by to catch those fumes. With a big piece like this, I'll simply pour it on, and then I'll use my little cloth to spread it around and get it evenly over all of the surfaces of the solder. Now, I want to just point something out, and this is so satisfying, but look how bright that copper patina came out. And the secret to that, in addition to everything that I just showed you, is that you want to apply your patina immediately after soldering. If you do that, you will have the brightest copper or the deepest black. Now, sometimes it's not perfect, but I found that the longer you wait, the more spotty and the less vibrant your patina is going to be. Now, I soldered this piece and I patinaed and did all of this all at the same time. There's no time in between any of this. So my patina came out super bright because of that. Just as I said before, don't forget about your little edges. There's nothing worse than a nice bright copper patina or a nice rich black patina, and then you got this weird little silver edge. No one wants it, so just make sure you do your edges. Now, same thing for the back. We'll go ahead and pour a little bit on and then just spread it out, and you will have a nice, even, super bright copper patina. I buy super cheap washcloths, and I like to find them at thrift stores especially, because whenever I'm done applying my patina or whenever I'm done polishing or anything like that with these tiny little cut up pieces of washcloth, I throw them out. I don't want them hanging around my studio. I don't want those chemicals stinking up the place. I just throw them out whenever I'm doing my cleanup after my soldering and patina process. I wash my piece with CJ's Flux Remover again, and once it's dry, I'll go ahead and come in with my polish. I personally use Leva polish, although you can also use turtle wax or really any other. I know there's Clarify. There's a bunch of other polishes as long as it has carnauba wax? Whatever it is, however you pronounce it. As long as it has that, you're good. I just get a nice squirt on there, and then I use my fresh little washcloth cutout and I apply it evenly over the entire piece. Just like with flux, you want it to be a nice even coat. You don't want it pooled up in your corners. So a lot of times I'll have some excess left over on the cloth, and then I'll simply just flip the piece over and apply it on the back. And the back usually has the perfect amount of wax. The front usually has a little bit more. And once everything's applied, you want to go ahead and let that sit for 5 to 10 minutes. I wait as small of a time as possible, and a lot of times I just sit there and I blow on it to try to dry it faster. But you want to let it sit, and you want to let it kind of form a fog over your glass and your solder. Now for your polishing, I want you to keep something in mind. you need to polish the soul out of this thing. You need to put some elbow grease into this thing. My table is so wobbly and it just goes, it looks crazy in there. And you can even see how just crazy unstable it looks in this video. You want to really get in there and just polish the dickens out of it, and it's going to make it so nice and shiny. And it's just, this is probably my favorite part of the whole process, really, because it's so satisfying. Look how shiny it is. Look at it. Don't mind me, I just get so obsessed with just making the shiniest stained glass possible, and especially because I love how this copper patina came out. Here you can actually see me trying to fix the table. It didn't really do much, but I tried to like kick the leg to make it shake a little bit less. I was unsuccessful. Now, I didn't do it for this project, but as a final little finishing touch, sometimes I'll go in with a cotton swab and I'll try to get the polish out of all the little corners and nooks and crannies. This piece was simple enough and the pieces were large enough that I did not have to do that. But sometimes for little tiny itty bitty pieces, I'll go in with that cotton swab just to get it nice and shiny. It usually takes me anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes to fully polish a piece, and especially if there's little copper wire details. I think that just about finishes our piece though, and I am honestly so excited and so happy with how this turned out. I really enjoyed using AI to kind of help me branch out past my regular comfort zone. I don't work with transparent glass almost ever, and I also don't make anything, symmetrical or abstract, so this was so much fun for me and such a nice change of pace. If you're still here at 36 minutes in, wow, thank you so much for watching. You are a trooper. I really hope you found this video helpful, and if you want to use this pattern, you can find the link to it to my Etsy in the description box down below. I think that something like this would be fun to do again, so if you have a suggestion for something I could type in for our AI overlords, please leave a comment down below.